ADHD Rewired, episode 554. Since 2014, this has been the podcast for ADHD adults who have really good intentions and a slightly wandering attention. I'm Eric Tivers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training and a coach by design. I'm your host, and I have ADHD. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. You can learn about our coaching and accountability groups, our virtual co-working community, and more. All at ADHDrewired.com. We are wired for connection, and you are not alone. Learn more about our offerings, including our quarterly live Q&As, get additional resources for every episode, including links to any resources we mention on today's show. You can support us on Patreon, sign up for our email newsletter, and more. All at ADHDrewired.com. And if this is your first time listening, welcome. Don't forget to hit subscribe or follow on your podcast app so you never miss an episode. We know that starting is the hardest part, so let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Rewired. Today's guest is Natalia Aíza. And Natalia is a seasoned therapist, parent trainer, writer, and entrepreneur. Her core missions are to facilitate awareness and healing for those with OCD and to amplify OCD competency among mental health practitioners. She is the co-founder of Kairos Wellness Collective, an innovative therapy center that specializes in OCD and anxiety disorders. In the last 3 years, Kairos has expanded to 4 locations in Colorado and has served over 2,000 families and individual clients. Natalia also advocates for OCD awareness and provides free psychoeducation on her popular Instagram account at letstalk.ocd. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
So where would you like to start? Talking about ADHD with OCD is really important because we know that ADHD, as I like to say, rarely travels alone and often has friends, and OCD is often one of those friends.
Very much so. So I would love to address the people who label themselves as anxious and ADHD and perhaps are being misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed and actually have OCD plus ADHD.
Okay. So why don't we start with what is OCD?
Okay, so obsessive compulsive disorder. It's known in pop culture as the organizing, ordering, hand washing, tapping disorder. I really see those very rarely. What I see most in modern OCD is things like fear of missing out, intense nostalgia OCD, checking social media compulsively, these sort of interacting with the outside world in a way that is meant to self-soothe, but ends up being very repetitive. So we're obsessed with kind of one of 3 things: our worthiness, how loved we are, and how safe we are. And then the OCD sort of revolves around those 3 aspects.
Okay. You just dropped a whole bunch of stuff that made my brain go in 30 different directions with lots of different questions. Intense nostalgia OCD. I have never heard that. What is that?
So these are folks that cry on their birthdays. These are folks who have a lot of trouble with their parents redoing their childhood bedroom as an office. It's this sense that we can't quite let go of the past. We'll never get it back again. It can lead to like hoarding memories, hoarding photos. It's a very strong connection to past events and feeling like there's going to be no substitute for them. And so we have to be clinging to those memories.
And how does that show up? Is it just in the situational like events that sort of trigger that, or is there this anticipatory component to it?
Oh, so much. All of the above. So these will be, I see it a lot in kiddos who are turning 7 years old and they're crying that they'll never be 6 again. And, if you really think about it, it is pretty sad. It's like an existential crisis. But oftentimes why OCD is missed is because it doesn't show up in an externalized way. People with OCD are often mislabeled as overly careful or overly sensitive or too rigid, But people aren't understanding that inside there is this constant churning, these incredibly difficult fear and anxiety spirals. And that's what we're trying to soothe.
Let me ask you this. So, my son, who's 13 and ADHD, autistic, highly gifted, he will often say that he really misses elementary school, and especially he's in eighth grade, so next year he starts high school. How would someone determine, like, are we dealing with also OCD, or is this maybe just a normal manifestation of his neurodivergence that we do know that he has?
So that's a great question. And that's why I wanted to come on this podcast and others that focus on neurodiversity to say there is actually a tremendous amount of overlap. With autism, for example, feeling an attachment to childhood freedom and joy, childlike interests, even as you get older, that's all a very normal part of autism. And so I would never diagnose or pathologize just that one little piece and say, oh, well, that's also OCD. So when there's want to be especially careful about diagnoses. We want to do for your son, for example, we would do the SciBox, which is the children's assessment for OCD. And we would have to differentiate the symptomology from what is better explained by his neurodiversity.
And then what about for us adults? What is this, just like wishing for simpler times, or are we actually dealing with a form of OCD?
So again, it's a level. So we might feel kind of an ick when we see something on the wall that's asymmetrical. Everybody might feel some level of ick. But a person with OCD and symmetry OCD, for example, they literally cannot stand the feeling of something being just a bit askew. And their attention will go to that askew object until it is remedied. So when we say, yeah, like I feel bad about this thing, I don't feel comfortable with this thing, it's really not pathological. It's just human experience. A person with OCD gets fixated, and we get determined to solve the problem, to fix it, and have a lot of distress intolerance for something not being just right.
And that's kind of the compulsive side of OCD, right? Where you feel like
Yeah.
you have to fix it.
Yeah, and they can't exist apart. So you can't just be obsessed and get the OCD diagnosis. You have to have that full cycle of I'm obsessed with something, I do a compulsion to fix that obsession, and I temporarily feel better, but it reinforces that fear or obsession that I had to begin with.
So you said you can't have the compulsion without obsession. Can it go the other way? Can you have?
So it's the other way, actually. So
Okay.
you can't have, yeah. So you can't have a diagnosis of OCD without having both obsessions and compulsions. If you're just obsessing, that's probably generalized anxiety. The compulsions are an act that is meant to soothe, and it can also be a mental act. So I might have this feeling of things aren't right in the world. I feel really uncomfortable. And I might have a compulsion of praying or meditating, which is so repetitive that it's starting to take so much time in my day in order to get myself back to baseline.
You had mentioned at the top about the sort of compulsion to checking social media. And so we're recording this on February 27th, 2025. And there is a lot going on in the news that is rightfully concerning. People share with me that they're terrified of what's going on, and I'm saying, then you're paying attention. How would you determine, right, what is sort of abnormal types of checking the news, doom scrolling, and what is an actual normal response to the current situation that we're in right now?
Yeah, it's really difficult to evaluate that. It has to come with a constellation of other symptoms. So OCD is not situational.
Mm.
It can be trauma induced, but it rarely stays in the place where it logically should be. So let's say we were living in a war torn country. Our OCD would rarely be obsessed with when the next bomb is coming. It would actually be focused on something trivial, like have my foods touched and contaminated each other. So OCD isn't reacting in a reasonable way to the environment. It's actually something far less logical than that, if that answers your question. So yes, people are compulsively doom scrolling. That is a thing. Some of us with OCD will have that habit. However, the deeper fear of I am not safe, something is wrong, existed before there was governmental change or before there was all of these other external factors. It's kind of a baseline fear that something bad is going to happen.
And when you say whatever the issue is that the OCD takes on, it's never about that issue?
Yeah, I wouldn't say never, but rarely, I would say. I can use a personal example.
Yeah.
So I used to, when my children were younger, I would have intrusive thoughts that I was going to throw them out the window. They make fun of me for this tirelessly now because they're teenagers and they low-key hate me. But I did not, in fact, throw any child out the window. But I did have the compulsion of taping all of the windows shut in my high-rise apartment and never getting within 2 feet of the window. So now, yes, my obsessions and my compulsions, they were all pretty specific about throwing my children out the window. But if you had psychoanalyzed me even just for 10 minutes, you would have realized that my deeper fear was that I was a bad person and a bad mom. And so my OCD decided to focus on windows for whatever reason. And I do know the reason, but it is not important to the story. And with OCD, the actual origin, the reason for the compulsion is actually not that important for the story.
Do you think that's hard to convince people of?
Oh, so hard.
So how do you do
Everyone,
that?
everyone comes in wanting to spill all the things about their childhood. And I have to say, you do in your introduction, yes, I am a therapist by training, but I'm a coach by intention. And while that is all incredibly important information for what formed you as a human being, it does not necessarily help us in the present. So tell me, in the present, what are your fixations and what does your brain tell you to do about them?
When did you realize that you also had OCD?
Mm. So ironically, I realized when I went on ADHD meds. So that was my
Say more.
oh, yeah. So I had always been labeled as anxious, sensitive, all the things. I knew that I had ADHD, at least on some level, especially once I trained as a therapist, but I never really thought of it as something that I really needed to tackle until I started my own business. And at that point, I realized I am so able to do all of these creative projects, and yet I cannot pay my bills on time and I can't invoice my clients and all that stuff. So I decided finally to pull the trigger, get my formal diagnosis with ADHD, go on the medicine. And within the first week of being on Concerta, I was compulsing in the most obvious way possible. My entire house was deep cleaned, reorganized. I was out of control. Honestly, 8 hours a day
Wow.
of cleaning, decluttering, organizing. And I couldn't even recognize myself because I am a naturally very relaxed person around this. And it clicked in my OCD. That was just one presentation of it, which the stimulant sort of made worse, made more pronounced. And as soon as that medicine wore off, my nervous system would calm down and I would no longer feel drawn to do these compulsions. So that was my first big clue because it was classic. And then my other big clue was during the pandemic, I was literally one of those people with the double mask and the groceries sitting in the garage and all the things. And so I saw that I was having a much more extreme reaction to the pandemic and having germophobia on a level that I had never had before. And so I started to put 2 and 2 together and understand how the other presentations of my OCD, like the taped windows, we're in fact all part of the same constellation of symptoms.
You mentioned germophobia. Where's that dividing line between reasonable precaution and neuroticism?
Oh, so hard to say. Depends on the person, depends on the situation. But I would say when we're trying to decide if something is compulsive, the question I love to ask is, how would it feel if someone stopped you from doing that action? Would you be mildly annoyed or would you be furious, terrified? Someone with OCD, we feel like it is such an urgent action that we can't possibly keep going unless we do the thing. So that would be how I would differentiate, not just like I really like cleaning or I really like sanitation, but rather I will not be able to go to bed until my house is sanitized because
Okay.
I'm afraid that something bad will happen.
Okay. I hate getting sick. I almost view it as if I'm near someone in public who is clearly sick, I almost view it as them being really aggressive. I did not consent to be in the same space with you coughing and sneezing. I'll be in Costco and I'll someone behind me and they'll clearly sick. And I will hightail it as fast as I can away from them, holding my breath until I'm far enough away. Is that a rational response to that, or is that suspect?
What do you think?
I hate getting sick because I'm a big man baby when I get sick. And I think it's actually part of my ADHD. My brain cannot filter. If something doesn't feel well, that's all my brain is thinking about. It focuses on that. So when someone says just a cold, that is the most minimizing phrase. I hate when someone says just a cold. Colds are miserable.
Hmm.
So you tell me, neurotic or semi-normal?
Yeah, I would definitely try a Cybox yourself. The great thing is that it's the Cybox, the Yale Brown OCD assessment. It's online, it's free, it's a survey format. It's really would only take about 30 minutes to complete. And then you can see sort of the full constellation of symptoms. But let me give you a different example
Okay.
on contamination that will sort of help elucidate this issue. So, right now, the it phobia, for whatever reason, is emetophobia, fear of vomiting. So, an emetophobe is so terrified of getting sick in that way that they will literally go to such incredible lengths that you would not believe in order to avoid anything and everything that could cause vomiting. So the disgust for vomit is so strong that actually one of the exposures that we have to do is we have to listen to hours of the sound of people vomiting to desensitize their systems to this fear because it tends to actually elicit a physical nausea response, even the watching someone vomit on TV. So that's the irrational part. Like if somebody vomits in front of you and you're like, dang, I don't want to catch whatever made them vomit, that is what it is. But when we have OCD, the actual phobia of it goes far beyond the dangers of really catching it. And it goes into this very absurdist, magical place.
When you were describing this, you hear someone talking about it. Here I am trying to put on a smile, feeling, okay, look, we don't need to go into more details about vomiting. Just thinking about all my listeners, just wanting to say, if you're feeling that, I'm with you. And I'm sorry. Could that be explained by something else?
Because this is a neurodiversity podcast, let's talk about it. If we, for example, have autism spectrum in addition to ADHD, we can actually have a much more ingrained disgust response than neurotypicals, than the normies. That is absolutely true. And for those people, if it's really just a disgust mechanism that's related to neurodiversity, we can listen to vomit loop tapes all day long and they will never actually get desensitized to that sound because systematic desensitization only works if it's an anxiety-based symptom.
Say that again, and then also explain what, yeah, sort of the opposite of that.
Okay. So when we have neurodiversity, basically forcing ourselves to be in uncomfortable situations, things that are uncomfortable to our sensory sensitivities, will not work long term to get us more acclimated. It does not actually code in the brain. If you hate high-pitched noises, you will hate them till the end. That is not something that repetition actually desensitizes you to.
So exposure-based therapy would not work for someone who's autistic.
No. And in fact, it's torture, and it's a little bit of the idea underneath ABA therapy.
Okay. This is interesting. Yesterday, I was at once a month, my alumni community, we have a social kind of happy hour. And one of our members it was actually one of our coaches, was sharing her mom had taken a bad fall and was kind of sharing some details of that. And I actually had to take out my headphones and walk away because I was feeling like the descriptions of it was like making my bones hurt, like that kind of uncomfortable. So are you saying that it's more likely a autistic trait, or it could be an OCD trait, or like anything in isolation, you can't really tell what that actually is?
Yeah, the latter, right? It's very difficult for us to talk about any symptom in and of itself. We want to look at the whole person. We want to look at, for example, do you have a phobia of your parents falling? Do you think a lot about mortality or health? Are these things that obsess you normally? And therefore, hearing a description of bones crunching would elicit, yes, it already has, I can see your face, would elicit a physical anxiety response.
Hmm. Okay. My brain's going in a bunch of different directions. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the cue of my brain going in 10 different directions for us to take a quick break. And I'll sort all those directions out. And when we come back, we will continue this conversation. So we will be right back. If you've been nodding along to this conversation about ADHD and OCD, and you're tired of getting stuck in those perfectionistic spirals, rumination, or overwhelm, you don't have to keep doing this alone. ADHD reWired's coaching and accountability groups are designed for neurodivergent adults just like you. Folks dealing with ADHD, plus all of its friends like OCD tendencies, anxiety, shame, and self-doubt. Summer sessions are July 24th through September 18th, and here's the important part. Registration for our summer sessions was just extended, which is great because you're listening to this right now and you've been thinking about it, looking for a sign, and I think this is it. So join us for our second chance registration event this Thursday, June 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 Eastern, and pre-registration submissions are due 24 hours before the event.
So if you're thinking about joining this group, I definitely think you should. If you're struggling with burnout, if you're struggling with executive function or emotional dysregulation, don't know how to write a to-do list, join the group and allow the collective experience really help you.
If you're thinking about joining this group, which, by the way, I can't recommend enough, and you can call me anytime and I'll tell you more about why, it's the time commitment.
If you're thinking about joining this group, if you are in the right place in your journey, you're ready to grow, you're ready to open up, you're ready to invest all that time and energy, push the button, join the group.
If you're thinking about joining this group, stop thinking, do it. There's no time like the present, do it.
Those were just a few of the voices from members who joined this spring. If you want to hear more of those voices, check 2 episodes back on your podcast feed. We had a special episode just featuring voices from our most recent season. Over the years, we've had hundreds and hundreds of alumni who have given their voice to share their experiences in group because they want you to have this kind of experience too. So if you want a space to build skills, practice new habits, and connect with a community that truly gets it, go to coachingrewired.com and grab your spot. That's coachingrewired.com. Support for this podcast also comes from our adult study hall membership community, ADHD reWired's co-working and body doubling community. Join us for our structured sessions or hop in and work with me in our 24/7 quiet co-working room where you can co-work with me on most Mondays through Fridays between noon and 5 p.m. Central. Try it free for a week. It's only $19.99 a month, or save by choosing our annual plan for just $150 for the year. To join, go to adultstudyhall.com. That's adultstudyhall.com. All right, and we are back. All right, so trying to identify, is this related to autism? Is this related to OCD? What about PTSD response? How do you because, people with PTSD may avoid certain stimuli to avoid being triggered by previous traumas. So how do you differentiate between that and OCD?
So that's a great question. And sometimes we actually don't know. Very unsatisfying answer, but we have to say, I don't know.
I actually really appreciate an I don't know answer because we don't hear that often.
Yeah, we really don't know. What we do know is that PTSD can also be treated through exposure therapy. It has its own type of exposure therapy, similar to OCD. So we can actually go back into traumatic memories. We can purposefully bring the triggers forward rather than flee them, rather than avoid them, as part of a compassionate healing journey. So when we have both, it doesn't really change the treatment outcomes, and it doesn't really change the methodology.
So you're kind of looking at functional impairment in a sense?
Exactly. So, for example, I will share that my own OCD was triggered. It came on very suddenly when I was age 7, right after I had witnessed a rape. And so my little 7-year-old brain was not able to understand what all it was that I had seen. And so I have vivid memories of starting my physical compulsions at that time. It morphed into many different things, and arguably I would have developed OCD regardless, because almost everybody in my family system has OCD. There's a strong gene in my family. However, that particular moment was what sort of unlocked its onset.
And I've heard that before, that especially with around hoarding, that hoarding can often sort of begin in response to some kind of trauma.
1000%. And speaking of hoarding, there is a huge correlation between hoarding and ADHD for whatever reason. And one of the things that they've been investigating is whether or not, because as people with ADHD, we tend to lose things more easily than others, whether or not that fear of losing things and the fear of not having your possession leads to that maladaptive behavior.
How would you determine that?
Kind of a question that doesn't necessarily need to be answered, because at the end of the day, the hoarding needs to be addressed by throwing out objects. We have to deal with the here and now, but philosophically and emotionally, it might be important to the person to reconcile that moment where they started the maladaptive behavior.
So let's talk about treatment approaches. So what kind of treatments are considered evidence-based, whether you're dealing with pure OCD or OCD and?
The first thing to note is that the medicine for OCD is an SSRI, which is most commonly chosen as Prozac or Zoloft, and it works really well. That's the positive side of things. I personally, after I started stimulants and it really unlocked this entire world of accelerated OCD symptomology, I did decide to go on an SSRI as well. And now the two augment each other. So I have the benefits of the stimulant, which is making me be able to focus on building my business and all these other tasks that before I would not have been able to hold in my mind. However, at the same time, I'm able to do so without a huge uptick in OCD symptoms. So SSRIs, they need to be dosed at about double what you would give someone for standard depression or anxiety. However, they are very effective. The other thing that is incredibly effective is exposure response prevention. This is known as ERP. That is gold star treatment, first line For most people with severe OCD, it ends up being a combination of the SSRI and ERP, exposure therapy. There, I would always start someone on ERP.
And explain a little bit what the process of ERP is. I used to do exposure work with clients when I worked with kids. So go ahead and share a little bit about like what that actually looks like in practice.
So I like to create a communal document, a diary of sorts. And in this document, we are going to have a full list of all of your obsessions. This is usually 20, 30 things that we would identify as these are the things that my brain tends to orbit around. Okay. When I can't fall asleep and I'm ruminating, which is a compulsion, by the way, this is what I'm ruminating about. So that's the O. So we get a nice long O list. And then we move on to the C, the compulsion. So these are the things, physical or mental, that I am doing in order to try to feel better about my fears, my obsessions. So that might be things like checking likes on social media. It could be appearance perfectionism, changing my outfit. It could be decision paralysis, which for someone with OCD can mean that you have such a strong fear of making a mistake that you make no decision in order to avoid that feeling. Right? So I list out all of the potential compulsions. And then I have my clients highlight what are the things that you actually really want to work on, especially with adults. Like our OCD isn't really hurting anyone. Most cases, it's such an internalized disorder. So I want my client to actually have buy-in. I would like to not feel this way in Costco, is what they might tell me, right? Just as an example. With that in mind, with their priorities in mind, we then create something called a fear hierarchy. So this is a list of sometimes 150 items that are in growing difficulty. So things that are lower in the fear hierarchy are things that just kind of give you a little bit of an ick, all the way up to a 10, which would be something that would definitely give you a panic attack and we probably wouldn't end up doing. And that's basically like our treatment plan. So we're going to slowly walk through that fear hierarchy.
And as a therapist, you're doing all these exposures with your clients, right?
So I never ask a client to do something that I wouldn't be willing to do myself. So for example, somebody with a contamination phobia, a 10 would probably be licking my doorknob. And so somewhere in that fear hierarchy, I will at some point lick a doorknob with them. And that's to demonstrate to my client, yeah, it's gross. Yeah, we might get sick, but we didn't die. No one died. It was okay. And in the OCD brain, something like that feels like it will definitely, like absolutely ruin us. And the truth is that we end up having these emotional corrective experiences where we realize that that thing that we fear so much is not actually that problematic.
So it's about changing the feedback loop.
Yes, exactly. Through new experience. And that's why OCD is not treatable through talk therapy. We can't talk ourselves out of OCD. Just doesn't work.
And which it can even be harmful to be talking about and processing the thing that you think is the issue, but it's just whatever it is that OCD is sort of latching onto.
100%, Eric. I went to 10 years of talk therapy that really just became reassurance seeking for me. It became me looping and compulsing to go to a therapist to be told, Natalia, you're a good mom. It's okay. Don't worry. And I felt like I needed that therapist to be telling me every week that I wasn't crazy. That was one of my compulsions.
So you said that rumination is, a big part of OCD. Is there any overlap or connection you think between what I think is commonly referred to now as RSD, and listeners will know that I take a little bit of issue with RSD only because it's not research-based. So many people in the ADHD community relate to it, so I think there's validity to it, but we need to research it so we can say, yes, this is its own unique thing. because my concern about it is could also be other things that could look like that, and it's important to understand the difference. So do you think that the rejection sensitivity, the fear of rejection, or even having been rejected, rumination about that is different from what is being considered RSD?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I share some of your concerns around RSD as a label. I often see it more as a sensitivity to lies criticism, which can be part of the perfectionism and the overachieving that many OCD plus ADHDers end up doing.
Is there a difference between sort of rumination about a perceived rejection or criticism in OCD compared to what people think about as RSD?
It's a great question, and it is incredibly common to have both OCD and ADHD. I just want to say that at the outset. About 20% of people who have OCD also have ADHD.
And what about vice versa?
So vice versa, the rates are about double. So if you have ADHD, you have about double the probability of also having OCD.
Okay.
So in the general population, the rates of OCD, it's disputed, but it's like 3%, 4%, and it's about twice that in the ADHD community.
Okay.
So when you have both ADHD and OCD, you will inevitably have that sensitivity to someone criticizing you, because OCD is asking you to be this perfected, flawless version of yourself, and ADHD is out here sort of messing that up. And so as we're trying to be this sort of better iteration of ourselves, if someone points out that we fall short of that, it can be overwhelming to our nervous system. So when somebody ruminates about a criticism, what they end up doing is creating what we call an obsessional story about it. And so someone might say, "Oh, Natalia, like that was really sloppy." I will then take it to the next level in my rumination cycle. And suddenly they're telling me I'm stupid, I'm worthless, they're going to fire me, they don't want to talk to me anymore, because I have allowed it to take a life of its own in my head.
So how do you address that in treatment?
Well, we actually lean into the fear.
Yeah.
So I have this core fear of being seen as stupid. And so I have to do exposures around sounding stupid and doing things that are embarrassing and make me feel like people are judging my intellect negatively. I have to push myself into being okay with being seen from that perspective as a person that is not as worthy as others. And once I'm okay with it, I'm able to release that over-analysis of other people's judgments of me.
So, perfectionism and ADHD are interesting bedfellows. Do you ever see perfectionism with ADHD without OCD being present?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I'm not sure. So perfectionism does not meet the clinical definition of OCD, but many people with OCD have perfectionistic features. So I would say perfectionism and OCD really go hand in hand with that core fear that we're not worthy. And it can end up being that perfectionism leads us to inaction. So actually avoiding doing a thing rather than doing it perfectly in order to not feel that sense of judgment of ourselves.
Do you also recommend exposure therapy for perfectionism?
I do. That's fun. That's a fun one.
Yeah.
I often have middle schoolers with this purposefully get a B on a
Yep.
test, and they're just like so aghast at that idea. And I say, trust me, like I was that kid. I went to Harvard. I did all the things, and it would have benefited me tremendously to get my first B in middle school, to feel that sense of, okay, well, I wasn't perfect, and yet nothing happened. So this is the classic overachiever paradox, where we feel like we have to work so hard in order to almost even justify being seen as intelligent as we are. And this is so common in the ADHD community, that sort of overperformance, overfunctionality, because we're terrified of being outed for our full neurodiversity.
Have you ever had an experience with someone doing kind of some kind of exposure therapy for perfectionism, where it almost swings too much in the other direction?
Is that a fear of yours, Aaron?
When my son was little, he would get really, really, if he had a little mistake on something, it was very dysregulating to him. So we created basically reward for making mistakes. And now he just doesn't really care very much about his performance on school-related stuff. How do we find that balance of not being neurotic about his grades and not making him think that it means everything, because it doesn't, but also encouraging to have a little bit of care in the grades and to put a little bit more effort in, or in other words, to give a few more shits than he's currently giving?
Well, honestly, for those of us who have OCD, giving 0 shits is nirvana. That is the best, because we tend to really suffer when we care deeply about things, to the point where we're not actually learning. Like, I was studying, I was not learning, Eric. I wasn't retaining, I wasn't building my knowledge base. I was literally just achieving that mark, achieving that perfect score, and then discarding it. So now at this point in my life, I'm able to not care at all around many things, and it's actually made me so much more successful professionally, personally, because it was the caring too much that was actually really holding me back and getting me way too motivated for the wrong things.
What about, and adding to the sort of the profile, if you have giftedness? I think about my son, who gets really upset with himself because he loves math, but if something doesn't come to him immediately, he doesn't just intuitively understand it, he gets so frustrated with himself. He's autistic with ADHD. How do you address that?
It's an additional neurodiversity. And so we have to add it to the soup. So ADHD plus autism plus ADHD. Sorry, I said ADHD twice.
Double the ADHD.
All the ADHD. I'm just so obsessed with ADHD. Giftedness, it is a surprisingly common, difficult neurodiversity. And with giftedness, that actually sometimes leads to even more sensitivity about being perceived as stupid. So as a child, I was labeled gifted, and that did not help my fear of being stupid one bit. In fact, it inflamed it, because then I was constantly looking for reassurance that I was in fact gifted, and I couldn't just be seen as normal. I had then raised the bar. And when I was seen as anything but gifted, black and white thinking went all the way back down to incapable. Those were the 2 categories for me.
Okay. Well, this has been actually really fascinating. You know your shit. So that was really, you definitely had shared some stuff that was new for me and just kind of eye-opening. Can you share where people can learn more about you, and if you have any other kind of OCD related resources, where can people reach out?
Absolutely. I'm not a big enough deal that I don't give out my personal email, so I'm just going to give out my personal email. It's Natalia at kairoswellnesscollective.com. I actually compulsively answer my emails, so reach out to me. I will answer your questions, I promise. Can also be found on Let's Talk.OCD, on Instagram. Most of the work that I do is around OCD. In the most specialized work is OCD when it comes to neurodiverse populations. I also really love working with families that are putting in the next steps needed for their child to launch. That is a population that I absolutely love supporting, because there's a lot of sort of counterintuitive parenting issues that come up when you have a neurodiverse child that is essentially stuck and needs to make that next move into independent living. So those are all the different ways you can reach me. I would love to speak more with you. Anybody who's listening, I will talk your ear off about OCD if you just give me the forum.
Well, thank you so much. We will put the links and your email address and all of that in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you. It was so fun.
Wow, what a powerful conversation. I'm struck by how many layers we carry when we live with ADHD and how easily those layers get tangled up with things like OCD, anxiety, and perfectionism. Conversations like this remind us that what shows up on the surface is only part of the story. It's like peeling back an onion. When we're committed to growth and self-discovery, it's amazing what we might find, even things we didn't realize we were searching for. And sometimes those discoveries become unexpected catalysts for growth. I've lived this myself. Years ago, I kept stumbling across information about complex PTSD, which nudged me to do an intensive trauma-informed therapy training. That's when I finally thought, maybe I should explore this for myself. 2 years of EMDR therapy later, therapy that helped me heal in ways I couldn't have even predicted, I've also discovered my own autism. Those hidden layers were there the whole time, waiting to be uncovered, and peeling them back changed everything. Growth rarely goes the way we expect, but if you stay curious and you stay kind to yourself, you might discover more healing, connection, and joy than you've ever imagined. And if you're listening to this right now thinking, maybe this is my moment, I want you to know it can be. There's no perfect time to start this work, but maybe there is a right time, and sometimes that's right now. Our second chance registration for our summer coaching and accountability groups is scheduled for this Thursday, July 10th at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 Eastern. And I'm really hoping to wrap up registration this time so I can shift to getting everything ready for our new season and give everyone a strong start. We may not have another registration event this summer after this, so if something in you is saying, I can't keep doing this by myself, trust that voice. Head on over to coachingrewired.com and take that next step. Get on the interest list and complete pre-registration 24 hours before the registration events. That's coachingrewired.com. And thank you so much for being here. Be kind to yourself. Keep peeling back those layers. And I hope you can join us this summer, where I want you to know it is safe to take off your mask. Until next time.